This is the Liberal Europe podcast by ELF, bringing liberal ideas into the political debate, with Leszek Jazdzewski and Ricardo Silvestre.
Hello, welcome back to Liberal Europe. My name is Leszek Jazdzewski, and today we're going to discuss the return of history to Europe. And I have a great guest today to discuss this very issue. Luuk van Middelaar, perhaps one of the best historians of European history and understanding European politics. He's a founding director of Brussels Institute for Geopolitics. He's a political theorist, historian, and the author of a couple of books, one of them being prizewinning The Passage to Europe, among many others. Luuk, welcome back to Liberal Europe.
Thank you for having me.
So I can't miss the opportunity to not ask you the question about how do you see the results of the recent Dutch elections? Do you see it as a sort of push to the center, as a sort of rejection of populist politics, or do you think it's mostly overblown and there's very different issues at play? How do you see that?
Well, of course, to start, the Dutch election had indeed a surprising result or a surprising winner with D66, the centrist liberal pro-European party, picking up most seats, about 1/6 of the vote, and coming on top. So what you could see indeed was a turn to the center, both through this winning party, D66, of leader Rob Jetten, who probably will be the next Dutch prime minister, but also to the Christian Democrats, who also like to occupy center ground. However, the first important nuance to make is that the radical right, let's say, has not lost, because there's not one party, which is Geert Wilders' PVV party, which was the biggest party at the previous elections. He lost 10 seats, indeed, more or less, because he wasn't able to honor the promises he made to his voters in a very chaotic 2-year or 18 months barely of the previous governing coalition, of which he was a member. So his voters were disappointed. But his voters did not flock to the center. His voters went to little sister parties. So the radical right bloc of 3 parties today still has, just as in the previous election 2 years ago, around 42 out of the 150 seats in the Dutch lower house, which means close to 30% of the vote. And that part is actually pretty stable. So what has changed is that, and I think on the, let's say, the remaining voters, they have indeed gone a little bit, you could say, to the center, but I would maybe rather say they have expressed a wish for governability, for some stability, for calm, for return to decent policy-making, decency as well, which is always a Christian democratic value they want as well. And so many voters were a bit fed up with the chaotic previous coalition, and they, in a way you could say, they betted on 2 horses in the center to bring about some stability. So the final notable fact here to mention is that the left fared relatively poorly. The historic Dutch Labour Party and the Greens, actually, they are in the process of merging, and their hope would be that joining forces between red and green, so to say, would allow them to again come out on top, or even second, which they did pull off last time, but not this time. They ended in a 4th place, which was rather disappointing. And the left in total has around 20% of the vote only. So that was historically low as well. These are the central facts and results. And of course, well, you can discuss how it compares to other countries and member states within Europe and the European Union, but it is maybe part of an overall trend, indeed, of a solid radical right bloc, and at the same time a desire for governability. And so you also see maybe that the old left-right axis is partly supplanted by populism versus governability, or anti-democratic versus democratic forces, if you want to put it that way.
The VVD made a promise during elections that it's not going to make a coalition with the Green Left Alliance. Do you think they're going to break it?
Yeah, that's indeed the coalition building. That's the big question now. The initiative will be with the two largest centrist parties, D66 and the Christian Democrats. And indeed, the question is what the other liberals, the more right wing liberals of the VVD, will do. I think it will be very hard for D66 to allow one of the radical right parties to join a coalition with the VVD and Christian Democrats. So not Wilders, but one of the smaller ones and supposedly more palatable. I don't think that will be an option that D66 as the winner and vis-a-vis its own electorate can swallow. So there are not many options. Basically, the only option is if you want to avoid coalition of 6-7 parties, it's the four largest parties in the center, and the VVD will have to swallow at some point its aversion, I think, of red and green, so to say.
Right. Well, we're going to perhaps wait and see for quite some time to
Yeah, I think Leszek, this is going to take some
yeah.
few months of psychodrama as it happens in coalition building countries like the Netherlands or Belgium or even France these days.
Yeah. Yeah, nothing's stable anymore. So yeah, it's I think it's perspective that's Netherlands is going to be back on the map as a prospective prime minister said is a promising sign. But the however the coincidence is quite opportune from the perspective of our listeners that I can ask you about the Dutch elections. It wasn't really the why I wanted to talk to you. Actually, it's interesting because I think a couple of months ago, then a Polish European minister sent me your article, "The Return of History to the Present," because it was sort of linked to what we conversed at the time, and it also reminded me of it's a very interesting essay you wrote at the beginning of the year, and it's accessible at the BIG Europe.eu website. We'll provide a link for the listeners. But it also reminded me of what you wrote at the Passage of Europe, that Europe has not still fully absorbed the earthquake of 1989. In fact, we have barely begun to assess its significance. So, can you talk perhaps a little bit more about it? How do you see this 1989 from today's perspective, and what is to be absorbed from it?
Well, thank you, Leszek. That's a broad question for a broad theme. Maybe first, a little bit about the semantics, about the definition. So, what could a return of history mean? Huh? Of course, I don't mean that history properly stopped in the meantime, but it is, of course, at the same time an allusion to Fukuyama's end of history theory, and which, whatever you say about it, kind of epitomized and expressed a certain belief, in hindsight illusionary, about the world after 1989 and how it would evolve. And I say this is an illusion, and that, of course, is no longer a scoop, but it's interesting, and it also brings us to analysis of the dynamics of European politics, how the return of history has been experienced by different people at different moments. I remember your current and former Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, but on the day when he took up his European office of European Council President, he actually said, history is back.
Yeah, you quote him in the book. Yeah.
I was there when in that handover ceremony between the two presidents of the European Council, because I worked for his predecessor. And then Tusk arrived and saying history is back. And of course, that was a very strong reference in 2014 to the invasion and annexation of Crimea by Russia. So it's the return of great power politics. That's definitely the central element there. And for Europe, that most of all means return of Russia and its direct territorial aggression, which was, one could say, experienced with some delay by the rest of Europe. Just take Germany, of course, the famous Zeitenwende by Olaf Scholz. That's just a few days after the 2022 full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And that was Germany's way of saying history is back. We experience a turn of the tide or even of the time, as the word Zeitenwende indicates. And we're changing eras, we're changing historic epochs. Even maybe briefly zooming out, for the rest of the world, I don't think this is about Russia so much, and it's more about China and the great power dynamics between the United States and China, and the fact that, like Russia, but China too, does not content itself with playing the more submissive part in the great play of world history, which was assigned to it after 1989, which was to become part of all the international organizations. The WTO in 2001 is, of course, a famous moment, and China becoming just like us. Now, China is, and that's something we have felt and experienced for over a decade now, was not satisfied and had no reason to be satisfied in terms of its potential and clout with that more modest political and strategic and economic role. And I think what the rest of the world is experiencing is, of course, also a return of great power politics, but in particular between the US and China. But in a way, it coincides. It's the same time period where both for Europeans vis-a-vis Russia, let's say somewhere between 2014 or even 2008, if you go back to the Russia-Georgia war of August 2008, and 2022, let's say, at the latest, 2022, all Europeans realizing, okay, the post-Cold War era is over. The period that started in 1989, we're no longer there. That's the period when, let's say, our generation, studied and grew up and started working. Our parents were maybe more Cold War, still as much part of their professional life. We are post-Cold War people, but the next generation will be post-Cold War in a way, and we don't have a name for it, but we do know that something new is happening. Now, to come to Europe, for the Europeans, this is, let's say, a rougher awakening again than for many other nations in the rest of the world, because many of them also see opportunities. But for Europeans, for us, the end of history, post-1989 world served us so well. It offered the prosperity of globalization and a system for which the EU also itself was very well equipped as a market-making machine. It offered us the regional and even global stability, with the US still as our protector. And I think what happened is that we went through a collective disarmament, a military disarmament. We no longer invested in our militaries, of course, very clear in Western Europe, but to some extent also in Central and Eastern Europe. And that's a very, let's say, well-documented fact, and people have woken up to it. And that's, I think, a good thing, obviously. But I would say that after 1989, something else happened as well. We disarmed also intellectually, conceptually. We lost the means to speak and talk and debate about our place in the world in terms of history and power and strategy and geography. So we, because we preferred the language of the law, of rules, of norms, which is a nice language, but we neglected, that's probably a good word, we neglected the language, the old historical language of strategy, power, geography, diplomacy, etc. And that is for the likes of us and for historians and philosophers and commentators and journalists and intellectuals, that's also an important part. And the role we play is to bring that kind of language, that kind of understanding of the world, that kind of perspective on current events, current affairs, back, thinking in terms of risks, threats, opportunity, and also, again, have a long term view. Maybe let me stop on that for now. When you look at the amazing flow of events this year, 2025, ever since Donald Trump came back to power in the White House and everything that happened, and no doubt you have discussed it on this platform as well with many of your other guests. One overall sentiment I think you can have is that the Europeans have shown signs of resilience and action, and they have improvised something, but overall they were really in a reactive mode. And they were not part of the action. They were driving it. They were not driving the action. They were more, sometimes bystanders, like in any peace negotiation or approach going in that direction between Russia and Ukraine and US, or reacting to Donald Trump and his tweets and tariffs. And that reactive mode, I think, is a kind of reflection of this lack of historic awareness. Historic in the sense of history in the present, the sense of you and I are discussing this now, because when you have incapacity to really look back and know where you're coming from, then it also becomes very difficult to look ahead and to project yourself in the future and to give yourself some direction. And that's where I think that's one of the points I wanted to make in the essay you're referring to, that a wider time horizon offers direction without the catalyst of imminent danger, which Europeans each time need. And if you look at China, of course, the Chinese leadership has a long-term direction. They think about 1949, the Mao's revolution, and they think about 2049, the centennial of that revolution, and that's their trajectory. And they also look back at China as a civilization. And Xi Jinping, who's very well aware of this interplay between past, present, and future, he has, strikingly for an older generation of communists, he has brought Confucius back as part of the mainstream Chinese thinking, whereas, of course, a generation or two ago, let's say in the Mao generation, that was absolutely taboo because it was old China, it was old religion, etc. But Xi Jinping is mobilizing that, just as of course Putin is also using the Orthodox Church. But the same is even true for Trump and the MAGA world. Of course, they improvise sometimes, but they clearly also have a long-term view. They just want to do away with the order as it was built after 1945. And maybe from our point of view, or from my point of view, it looks like they're basically destroying things, and they are. But from their point of view, they're also building a new order. They want to fundamentally change the course of history, and they want to make an end to the post-1945 order where, of course, the US was underpinning the whole international system. And that worked quite well for them. For the Americans, I would say for 80 years. But the US electorate no longer is convinced of that. And that drives, of course, much of this dynamic. But they want to put in place a new order for the next 100 years. That's something I picked up from people in around Washington. They really have a view, okay, we're changing epoch as well. And we are accelerating that change of epoch. And we in Europe, we find it very hard to think in those terms. And as I said, we are reactive. There's some apathy and fear as well, and astonishment at the speed of action of the Chinese and the Americans, some naivete as well, quite often. So there really, I think it's important that we, not just, again, to finish on that, not just, let's say, militarily in terms of hardware, re-equip ourselves, but also, again, mentally, conceptually, intellectually, however you want to put it, but to be better equipped to deal with the world of tremendous change and forces, which quite a number of which either want to destroy us or just make us into a play field for themselves?
Right. So you answered some of the question that I was supposed to ask you, but it's fine. It's interesting for me coming from the Eastern Europe to see that in many ways the whole region tried to escape the history, actually looking to European Union and NATO as the way to exit the place where there is more history or more past than in the other places. Just making this like William Gibson said, that future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. It's just, I think, the same with the past. And but paradoxically, joining EU and enlargement, or I would say rather incorporation than enlargement, actually sort of restarted history, because in many places, Orban and Kaczynski, including, it's really sort of allowed those countries to pursue a very different politics than the sort of restriction and restraint that they tried in the past. But there are many interesting things in your essay. One of them is actually the sort of link to Machiavelli, and I really like the way that you try to re-dramatize the way we think about politics in Europe. I think it's extremely important in your work overall, and in a drama you need a protagonist, and you ask yourself, well, you need a state, a nation, a social group, a deeply political act that defines a we. And I think one of the problems with Europeans is that it's not with European Union. It's not, I think, very clear whether it is a stage or if it's an actor. And I wonder, do you see who do you see responding to the current of events? Who do you see to listen? Who do you ask to listen to Machiavelli? Is it European leaders? Is it European community as a whole? Can we treat it as a protagonist at all?
Yeah, I'm easily drawn to the theatrical metaphor as a way to describe interaction in politics between the actors, but also there's the stage, there's the public, the audience, and in the case of the politics we're talking about now, it's not the national domestic stage, but it's the world stage. And the part Europe plays there is has shrunk. I think that is Europe is a let's say a smaller actor than it used to be, and it is finding ways and means to deal with that fact. And one interesting element there, of course, the internal question: who speaks on behalf of Europe? Can it be just one person, and is that then or is it a number? And that one person, should it be an EU person, or is it a national leader like French presidents? They like to say and think, l'Europe c'est moi, basically. And they can, to some extent, embody some of Europe, or is it France and Germany together? Which maybe also in certain, for instance, during the Eurozone crisis, which of course Poland is not a member of, but there, when France and Germany acted together, you could say it was a European decision. But today, in the era of Trump and Putin and Xi, it is clear that not a single or even duo of European leaders cuts it. And I'm referring, of course, also here to that famous visit to Donald Trump in the White House of no less than 8 European leaders, if I remember correctly, when the whole of Europe was again, just as this spring, February, March, but again in the summer, very worried after the Alaska meeting between Presidents Trump and Putin that Ukraine would be sold out. So we had, from top of my head, but we had Macron, Merz, and Starmer going there, so the big three. But Meloni was there as well, Italy, and Finnish President Stubb was there as a kind of bringing the voice of a neighbor of Russia. There were 2 institutional actors with Commission President von der Leyen and NATO Secretary General Rutte. And I'm afraid I'm forgetting something, but somebody. But well, of course, Zelensky. Zelensky was there as well. Yeah, that's why there were 8. So in a way, they needed to be 8 or maybe 7. If I give Zelensky a special status there needed to be 7 to have the weight collectively of swaying Trump, of working on the mind of Trump, and of outdoing Putin's more one-on-one, one should say, conversations with Trump. The Europeans, they need to be 4 or 5. They also had these phone calls. So I find it interesting. I think it's too easy to just ironize it and to be ironic about it, or to just say, well, let just an EU president go, or let just Macron and Merz, France and Germany go, or maybe with Tusk for the Weimar Triangle. That does no. You need Europe today. It is clearly. It feels more strongly its unity of a territorial and political entity, partly embodied by the EU, but not only, because Starmer was there as well, and the NATO was there. So Europe does exist, and it tries to find a voice, but it is a plural voice. But nevertheless, it was listened to, because that meeting that did work. So it's hard work, and it looks a bit particular sometimes. But I think the Europeans and also European leaders collectively are realizing this. There's, I think, one of the interesting things this year is the return of Merz to the scene. He's more vocal also in foreign affairs than his predecessor Olaf Scholz. The UK is more back as part of Europe with Starmer, but also because the British, for their part, also feel whatever their ambiguities, and they are endless, but the Brits too feel a kind of belonging to Europe as a continent, as a territory, and they know that they share some strategic and security interests with the rest of us on the other side of the channel. So these, as a result of this war, as a result of this return of history, there is that kind of awareness of Europe, not just in the EU sense, but really in a territorial, historic, dare I say, civilizational sense, getting form again.
Look, if I might just ask you very briefly, the very last question, going a little bit over time, but one of the lessons from reading your different books is that the real political of Europe is shaped by events. This is the responses. This is the essence, how the council is basically responding in many different ways. I wonder, how do you see, what sort of Europe do you see emerging from responding both to Russia invasion of Ukraine, but also perhaps most profoundly to Donald Trump dismantling American empire also within Europe?
I think you put it rightly, Leszek, that the challenge of Trump is even bigger to some extent than the challenge of Putin. Also in historic terms, Putin, as we put together with Xi Jinping, that put an end to the world which started in 1989. But what Trump is doing, as we discussed, is putting an end to the world which started in 1945. And especially for Western Europe, that's perhaps clearer experience, but from the world at large, I think that can also be said. So that challenge, Europeans didn't want to get their head around it during Trump won. They were just 4 years waiting for a Democrat to win the election. This time, I think we are more serious about it as Europeans, but not serious enough. I think what is lacking, and you mentioned, we discussed this kind of reactiveness, politics driven by events. What is lacking is more strategic foresight, not just in the sense of planning, because you cannot plan everything, but just thinking ahead, increasing resilience, seeing long-term trends, demographic, energy, economic, seeing the rise of China, thinking also beyond the US-China dynamic and our role in it. I think that is still lacking, and that is something we collectively, as those of us who think and talk about these issues, have to make the case for more strategic foresight.
This was, well, thank you. Look, I think it's a good note to end. Our guest today was the head of Brussels Institute for Geopolitics, Luuk van Middelaar. Luuk, thank you so much for being with us at Libera Europe.
It was a pleasure. Bye, Leszek.
That's all for today from me, and please tune in for Ricardo Silvestre next week. Until 2 weeks. Goodbye.
You were listening to the Liberal Europe podcast by the European Liberal Forum. This podcast was co-financed by the European Parliament.